ZipDX welcomes
Universal Voice.
Welcome to our webcast on executive presence. I'm Neil Kulik. I lead the Conference Board's Talent Management Institute, and I'm really excited about today's topic because it often comes up, is discussed and debated when we bring talent management professionals together. There seems to be a few things that everybody agrees upon on this topic. One is having a strong executive presence is an important asset to any leader's success. Number two, we don't really have an agreed upon definition or means of measuring executive presence, and that's an issue and that's a problem. And finally, in spite of not having a lack of definition, we all feel that we know executive presence when we see it. So today, we're really, we're trying to accomplish a couple things. We're trying to move beyond this idea of I know it when I see it into something much more disciplined. How do we measure it? How can leaders develop it? And is there a linkage between developing executive presence in an individual leader or a team of leaders and organizational success? To help me do that, I want to welcome Suzanne Bates, who is the president of Bates Communication, which is a consulting firm that focuses on leadership development, how leaders impact organizations, and she has done a great deal of research on this topic, and I know will illuminate us greatly on these questions that we just brought up. So, a few housekeeping items before we get started. I think they may be scrolling on the bottom of your screen, I'm not sure. But the most important thing is when you want to ask questions, on the bottom left hand of your screen, you should see a little pod, and that's where you can ask your questions. It's my job to kind of curate those questions, and I'll do the best I can. But as we do the presentation, as Suzanne goes through it, we will have some stop points, which will be natural places for us to ask questions. So we'll try and manage that the best we can as we go forward. Also, you can download this program. It's being recorded, and the PowerPoint is available as well. So let's get started. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing. There is credits that we can earn. You can see that on the slide. I'm not going to take the time to go through that, but continuing education credits are available for watching this webcast. So we're going to get started by getting you involved, you the participants. When you think about the concept of executive presence, what one or two words come to mind? What one or two words come to mind? And please type your responses in that chat pod below on the left. And I'll kind of monitor these. Trust, confidence, authenticity, influence, charisma, engaging, energy, clear communications, confidence again, integrity. So you can get an idea how we're all thinking about this. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Suzanne to talk about how she defines it and the research that went behind that. But before I have Suzanne do that, Suzanne, tell people why you got so interested in the topic of executive presence.
Oh, thanks, Neil. Well, precisely because those are the responses that we often hear when we ask about executive presence, and yet it isn't very clearly defined. As a matter of fact, about 6 or 7 years ago, I was attending a conference board event, and the speaker was talking about executive presence. She was presenting research done. It was a global survey of executives on what they thought executive presence was. What struck me was that there were no empty seats. Everybody came back into the room to hear what she had to say because, of course, we're all curious about this phenomenon of executive presence. So I went looking because we've been working with leaders at that point for 15 years, and we were often asked to work with them on executive presence because our specialty is communicative leadership. And I went looking for an assessment of presence and didn't find one. So we decided to develop one ourselves. And we started with this notion that, of course, as you know, people often think of executive presence and they say, well, I'm not sure, but I know it when I see it. And as you said, unfortunately, that isn't a very good answer for leaders who are trying to develop their presence and influence. And it's also a terrible answer for those of us who are in leadership development, talent, human resources, HR business partners who are trying to help our leaders develop presence. So we decided to take, as I say, a research-based approach, and we looked at all kinds of research. We looked at leadership and management theory. We looked at communication theory. We looked at social action theory, which is, how leaders work in an ecosystem. We looked at psychology and even philosophy and ethics because we wanted to get at those aspects of the whole person that give them the presence and influence that makes a difference. And what emerged for us was a model of a leader, if you will, in 3 dimensions. And this is important because, a lot of the ways that we tend to describe presence are the outward-facing aspects of a leader. So those, what you might call style, ST there in the 3-faced person. So we do address style in the model, and then we also look at what we call substance and the character of the leader. So we're going to be looking at the model in a minute, but first let's define our terms. Executive presence, what is it? Well, describes more fully and more broadly what it means to have presence and influence others to that leader, but also what it means to the organization, the impact that a leader can have on an organization in mobilizing effort and getting things done when they have the power of presence. So the research-based model, has those 3 dimensions, character, substance, and style, and within each of those are 5 what we call facets or aspects of executive presence. And all of this was developed into an assessment that we're going to talk about later that was validated and by independent researchers, and it's now being used across the world. So in a moment, we're going to take a few minutes to define each, and I'm actually going to be asking all of you to participate in a poll on which you think are your greatest qualities of presence and maybe some gap areas for you. But first, I often get asked about how you can possibly measure qualities like these, like authenticity, one of the most talked about aspects of leadership today, and how you can measure it. Well, it begins really first by defining it in terms of leadership. So for each of these qualities of presence, we have a definition, and in authenticity, what we're talking about in leadership specifically is being real, transparent, and sincere in one's relations with others. And authenticity goes to trust. So how do we measure it? Well, it's a 360 or a multi-rater assessment. So what you're looking at right now, and this will be familiar to any of you who've ever taken a 360 or any of you who use 360s in your coaching and leadership development, you're looking at 2 of the 6 items or questions on the 360 that address authenticity. And so you can see we've broken it out also by rater groups in the colored bars, and also by the differences among the raters in the black bars that run across the way in each of those. So, Neil, I'll ask, what do you notice when you look at this sample report? Anything jump out at you?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that question, and 2 things jump out at me. One is that the direct report responses to sincerity vary widely, which tells you something that not everybody sees this leader in the same way. And then on question 2, it looks like the manager didn't respond, which might be oversight, but it might be sending a message. So those are the 2 things that I thought about when I looked at this.
Yeah, precisely. So those of us who are leaders know that that's valuable data because it really is the beginning of an inquiry. It's the beginning of a question, really, that needs an answer. And that's really how we think of assessment, not as a be-all, end-all, this is who you are personality test, but in a 360, you're looking at behaviors people notice. And then you can start to ask questions like, I wonder why the manager didn't answer that. Maybe it was an oversight. I wonder what would cause my direct reports to have such a widely various view of me and authenticity in this particular item. So like I said, it's the beginning of an inquiry. So what we're going to do now is take a look at each of these dimensions of presence, starting with character. And I'm going to ask each of you to listen in, because we'll have a poll at the end of the character segment. So this will just be a few seconds on each of the qualities so we can define our terms. And I'd ask you to listen and ask yourself, which of these 5 qualities would other people say is my towering strength? So we've talked about authenticity. And in the character realm, we're really talking about qualities that accrue to a leader's trust. So why do people trust them? So again, you can imagine a leader who's viewed genuinely as genuine, sincere, and transparent, dependable, not too guarded, shares stories of his or her leadership, is more trusted. Integrity is a quality that most people would say is their rock, their pillar. It's a complex quality of executive presence by design. We measure a couple of different things. One of them is moral integrity, which is doing the right thing when nobody's looking, but it's also walking the talk, doing what you say you'll do, showing up to meetings on time, making sure you follow through on promises. Concern is the next quality in the 5 in character. And when you see the word concern, you think about how caring a leader is, but it's really more than that. It's the leader's ability to take an active interest in the development of another person, by listening, by encouraging them to stretch and grow and try new things. Restraint is also in the character realm, and it really goes to temperament. And just a hint, in all of our research, this is one of the lower rated facets. But it's really, though somewhat how we're wired, it's also a learned response. And it goes to a person's ability to come to that leader and be able to share bad news and expect them to be calm and balanced and reasonable in their response. The last of the 5 is humility. And we tend to associate humility with being self-deprecating, but probably a better headline for that facet would be, are you open to learning from other people? Are you curious about their ideas? Do you believe they have something to contribute? Do they expand your own point of view? All right, so time now for the poll question, and I'm going to ask you again to vote here, and we'll put up the poll right now and ask you to vote on which of these represents your towering strength. Is it authenticity, integrity, concern, restraint, or humility? So Neil, while everybody else is voting, I'm going to ask you to tell us how you're going to vote.
Oh, that was a surprise question. I would probably say that authenticity would be my number 1 strength.
And how would you say that has helped you in leadership?
Because it leads to so many other things, which is people trusting what you say, which is so important. And I think if you're authentic, then your integrity must be pretty high, because there has to be a high correlation between that. And it's just a lot easier to live your life if you're authentic and not worrying about covering something up or not telling the truth or something else.
Yeah.
So I've always admired that in the leaders that I've worked for. So that's something I think I've always tried to do myself.
Yeah, it's a very important quality. I think we're just about ready to end the poll. So we'll say in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. So interestingly, the majority are with you, Neil. Most people said authenticity would be what others would say is their towering strength.
So much for me being unique.
Yeah. Yeah, so look, and one thing that's important to note, this is just for purposes of our conversation today, most of you would have numerous strengths, and those would be rated on a Likert scale, and you would be getting a 1 to 5 rating from lots of people and an average on that. But it is kind of fun to think about what really defines your leadership. So we can move on back to the slide deck now, and we'll talk about the second dimension of executive presence, which is substance. Substance, if character goes to trust, substance goes to the credibility of the leader. So these are qualities that are learned over time, and they tend to be qualities that are gained as we gain greater wisdom from doing the right things and making mistakes as well. And one of them, the first one, is practical wisdom. So what is practical wisdom? In leadership, it's a display of insight and judgment. And it's not just that you have good judgment, but that you're able to lead a group to make good decisions. So this is the leader who asks great questions, appreciates the nuances, deepens the insights for other people, and inspires people to kind of get to the point and move forward and discuss what matters. Confidence is, of course, important in leadership. It's very important here to define our terms, because we're not defining confidence as that self-efficacy that's talked about so much. It's not how you feel inside so much as what are the behaviors that you display to others and what impact does that have on them. So we're measuring, is the leader able to get the group to focus on the facts, consider the options, debate the issues, and move forward and make a decision? Are they tolerant of risk and yet still decisive and secure in helping the group move forward? Composure is a close cousin of restraint, which we saw in the character realm. But what's different about it is it's how we respond in times of crisis or in difficult times. So it's bringing objectivity and perspective and rationale to the task of problem solving. Think of the emergency room doctor who is leading a team. They have to be calm. If somebody's rolled into the emergency room with a gunshot wound, they've got to know what to do. That's what composure is. Resonance is one of those social emotional qualities, EQ qualities of executive presence, and there are several in the model you may have noticed. It's the quality of being attentive and attuned and dialed in to how others are feeling. So you're reading the room and you're also able to anticipate how people might feel about a decision that's made. How might they react to that? And then finally, vision. Vision, like many of the qualities of presence, is multifaceted. So here we're talking not just about the leader who's a strong thinker, who can look ahead and set strategy, though that's very important. It's also, does the leader help others imagine an exciting future and bring them along on the journey? Are they able to excite them to get engaged and involved in helping making the vision happen? So those now are the 5 qualities of substance, and we'll ask our team to put the poll question up again and invite you to let us know, how would you vote? How would other people say you show up? What would they say is your towering strength? Is it practical wisdom, confidence, composure, resonance, or vision? So Neil, now you know the next question I'm going to ask. How would you vote?
I would probably go between practical wisdom and vision and try and toggle between the two of those to say which I think, personally, I would say is one of my strengths. So practical wisdom, I'm pretty confident about. Vision, I think I have good vision. I'm not sure I've always been able to articulate it in an inspiring way. So that could be a challenge, but I think I have a pretty good sense of what the future could be, and so that's how I would vote myself.
Yeah.
Modestly.
Well, it's actually fairly common for leaders. We find when they're mid-career, high potentials, they're going through the assessment, they might get good scores on being a strong thinker, those types of items. Less so sometimes on painting an exciting picture of the future. It's an area of development for a lot of leaders. But what's wonderful is when they get that information, they have the data, they now know, well, what part of vision do I need to work on? So I think we could probably close the poll. Looks like we've got just about the same number of voters here. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, we'll close it. So what do you think of the results, Neil?
Oh, I think I'm not totally surprised. Practical Wisdom came out, actually by far the first one, and Composure was number 2. So I don't know if that's would be typical. What do you think, Suzanne? Is that typical of what you normally get?
Well, you know, we have a mix of folks joining us today. We have people who are in business leader roles. We have people who are in human resources roles. So it would be hard to predict overall. I will tell you, though, generally in our data, because we have done a lot of data analysis, and we're going to talk about that later, composure is one of the lower rated facets overall in every company. And there's a real downside to that, as we'll discover, but composure is really important, for example, in driving innovation. So making people feel safe if they come in and want to try something and it's a bad idea. So there's a lot of reasons why composure is something we want to attend to. All right, why don't we move on to the third dimension? Yes, go ahead.
Just a comment. We have a couple questions that have come in, but I know you're going to get to a place where there's going to be a slide that says reflection, so I'm going to try and bring them in then and let you continue your flow to get through this section on definition.
Okay, that's great. Yes, we'll definitely get to as many questions as we can. All right, so let's move on to the slide deck and we'll take a look at the third and final dimension of executive presence, which is style. So what is style? In the broadest sense, it's a way of doing things. And the qualities that you see here that we're going to talk about in just a second really go to how do leaders get others to get things done, or in a word, execution. So what are those qualities of style that are important? Well, first, appearance. It had to show up somewhere in the model, right? It's a lot of how we think about presence. But when we look at the research, what's important is not only that leaders show up appropriate for the day, appropriate for their life, whatever that is, but also that they show up with that vigor and vitality that is contagious, really, in an organization. So when a leader shows up ready for the game, everybody around them knows they have to show up ready for the game too, and that's a big part of execution. Then there's intentionality, which is what we like to say the first of the 3 I's in the style category. Intentionality goes to how we get others to get things done. Some people have referred to it as vision with a little v, because it's purposeful communication. We're clarifying direction. We're making sure everybody knows what their roles are. We're making sure we end every meeting by checking in with people. We have an open dialogue going all the time so that we're moving things forward and getting things done. Inclusiveness is also split into 2 parts, like many of these. Part of it is the leader getting the right people to the table, which is how we often think of inclusiveness. But it's also, when those folks are at the table, does the leader create an atmosphere where those people feel empowered, where they show up and feel they're respected, that they are encouraged to share their ideas. So that's a leader who's really approachable and engaging and respectful of differences. And then the last of the 3 I's is interactivity. Let me go back to that for a moment. So interactivity is the dialogical side of communication for the folks who are really interested in the research on this. It's today, it's really being conversational and informal in the way we communicate. So we rely a lot on email, as we know, but even that needs to be less hierarchical, more dialogical. We have to be open, accessible, lots of skip level meetings, accessibility to leader, really enable those leaders to be seen as high in interactivity. And then finally, the last of the 15 qualities of presence is assertiveness. And while assertiveness is the leader's ability to get issues on the table and get them discussed, it's also the impact they have on others. So think of the leader in the meeting who encourages the debate, who makes people unafraid to disagree with one another, to have constructive conflict, because by creating that space, of course, and challenging others for a purpose, we get to better answers. So now you know the drill, only this time I'm going to ask you, before we vote, listen in, I'm going to ask you to vote on the one people would say is your greatest development area. So which one of these is a gap? So now we have to be authentic, although you have the anonymity of just voting, right? But I'd love to see which one of these others would say is your greatest development area. Is it appearance, intentionality, inclusiveness, interactivity, or assertiveness? So Neil, this time I won't ask you to reveal your greatest gap area, but I will ask if you'd like to share which one you think will be the lowest, or which one tends to be the lowest among these.
Oh, I would probably say interactivity or assertiveness would probably be the lower. And I would say for myself, and I'm not embarrassed to say, for my lower one would probably be interactivity, because I'm someone who oftentimes gets an idea in my head and I don't do enough networking around that idea to bring other people in. So I know that's something I've had feedback on, and that's probably where I would rate myself, on the lower side among those dimensions.
Yes, and that's a challenge for a lot of people. And it's partly a challenge because we're just dealing with such complexity today. Many of us are in global organizations. We run teams that have lots of interaction, so there's a lot of coordination that has to happen. And we only have so much time, and we have to choose our methods of communicating. So it is a challenge for a lot of leaders. When they get the feedback, though, at least they know they can attend to it. So I think we'll close the poll again in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And what I notice now is assertiveness was the one that most people said would be their lowest rated facet. Not a surprise, because assertiveness is a challenge for lots and lots of us. You know, we value people getting along. We value harmony. And sometimes that value of harmony can actually harm us as leaders. It can prevent us from getting the best ideas out of people, like we said. And a lot of people avoid conflict anyway. So it really requires a front-footedness in a leader to be able to be confident and self-assured enough and make it safe enough for people to feel that they can disagree without being disrespectful. So not a surprise there to see that that's one of the lower rated facets. So I think now we'll go back to the slide deck, and Neil, you mentioned that we have some questions, and I'd like to ask people, while we have this reflections slide up, to type in their questions and let us know what has this stimulated for you so far. Neil,
So we
want
have,
to throw a question at me?
Yeah, let me give you a couple questions that I was monitoring so that you don't have to look at that, the pod there. So one person mentioned that, you know, how does people can manage up really well? So how does that factor in when you're using a 360? How reliable is it, the boss's ratings, when you know an individual may be managing up very differently than they manage across or to their direct reports?
Yeah. Well, the manager's rating is called out separately. So for the leader, that's very important data. If there's a big discrepancy between how the manager rates that leader and how the direct reports or the peers rate that leader, that is the beginning of a good conversation to have. So if a coach, if you have a coach or you are a coach, we're working with that leader, the first question we might ask is, why might there be a discrepancy there? And, you know, we have always advocated that leaders go back to their raters and make it a nice, safe conversation, sit down with them, say, I'm curious about some things, not show them the report necessarily, but go in with questions, because until we understand better why we're getting those ratings, then we're not going to be able to change perceptions or change our behaviors. So this could be how a leader might finally learn that his or her ability to manage up isn't necessarily serving him or her well.
Good. Another quick question. How do you see the feedback varying like across industry? And I know you've worked across a lot of industries. Is that much of a factor in leaders?
Well, I think there certainly are some tendencies of maybe types of businesses. So in a business where flawless execution is very important, for example, you might see in a cohort of leaders, and we'll actually see one in a few minutes, you might see qualities like confidence and appearance and sometimes assertiveness dialed up. And you might see qualities like resonance or concern dialed down. You'd also see maybe high integrity. So yes, there are patterns, and it's a situated assessment. So what's most important is what's going on in that particular company at that time, because you could have a high growth, high innovative, flawless execution company that's doing very well, that has more even kind of scores in those areas. So it's a fascinating snapshot, if you will, to be able to look at an individual company and say, what's the culture of our leadership right now?
Good. So I'm going to move us along. There's a few other questions. Some of them relate to the next topic that we're going to be getting into, which is how do we measure this concept and how do we develop leaders around that? And which of these dimensions are most important and most challenging to develop? So let's move to that section, and then we'll have another opportunity for reflection as well.
Okay. Well, we can measure presence, as you know now, because we have taken these behaviors and codified them and put them into an assessment. It's, as I said, it's a multi-rater assessment with 90 items on it. And we've been gathering data here on this 360 for about 6 years globally. So we have a lot of data now, and we've actually been able to look at leaders in at least 21 countries, because we have certified practitioners of using the XPI in coaching and development, both inside corporations and independently now in 21 countries. And by the way, if you're interested in getting certified, Neil and I will talk about how you can get in touch with us at the end of the broadcast. We also have data from every industry. So we're pretty confident that the data that we've been able to analyze, we're doing a lot of data analytics now on leaders, is real and it's valid. And the reason we wanted to be able to look at the data is probably obvious. It would be important to understand what are some of the trends that we notice when we look at data on leaders in these qualities of presence and influence. And again, remember, we're measuring the leader's ability to engage, align, inspire, and mobilize action, right? So what happens? We've all had this experience, whether you're a leader or whether you're in talent or HR. There's a group of leaders who come together around a table, and they're considering the succession plan. They're looking at who belongs in the succession plan, who's ready now for leadership, who would be ready in a few years. And in spite of whatever data may be available to them, the conversation often defaults to, yeah, but I like him or her. Neil, I know you've had that experience because you've been in the talent arena for a long time, right?
For sure. Yeah, I think I've seen that quite a few times, but there's been a real focus on assessment in different types, whether it be 360 assessment or other kinds of assessment. And I see more and more leadership teams getting more sophisticated around good data and trying to control themselves from likability, if you will.
Yeah, I do too. And I think it's really exciting to see that developing. And I think in large part it's because executive teams and even boards of directors are taking their responsibility seriously for succession planning and making sure that they have leaders in place who are not only prepared to lead now, but have the ability to do the things they need to do to execute their strategy. So what can happen in an organization, as you know, Neil, is when you have a 360 you're relying on that you believe applies broadly to your leadership, then it can really change the conversation in the organization. I wanted to share some data from an organization we worked with. It was a Midwest-based but global defense and aeronautics company. And when we went in to begin working with them, we worked with 23 leaders, and they all completed an XPI assessment. So what I'm going to show you now were the results for one of those leaders. And what you're looking at are Amanda's strengths and gaps. What you see are 3 items circled in green. Those represent her 3 highest rated facets overall on the XPI. So there would have been some agreement there between her manager, direct reports, and peers, and self, because she rates herself on what her best qualities are. And then circled in red are her 3 lowest rated facets. So let me tell you a little bit about Amanda. She was a succession candidate to become CFO. And when she took the assessment. She learned that people thought she was really authentic and had high integrity, and that was true. She was somebody everybody really liked a lot. They felt like they got a straight answer from her. They could always count on her to do the right thing, and she always showed up with a lot of energy and vitality. The challenge for her was integrity was almost an overstrength because she had very, very high standards, and when you combine that with low restraint and low composure, what you had was a leader who was at best wearing her emotions on her sleeve. When people came in with bad news, she often let them have it. She was really tough on people. And her practical wisdom also wasn't really shining through, so her emotions were overriding her practical wisdom, even though she really had it in spades. So here was a CFO who saw her in the succession plan, but others around her didn't necessarily see her as effective a leader as she could be. So even though they liked her, they were afraid of her. So we started working with her, and we did a couple of things. One of the things that we did is we asked her to make sure she was apprised of the projects that were going on prior to having her meetings with some of these groups. She had a very large organization, and very often part of the reason for her emotional outbursts was that she was surprised by what was happening. So if they were behind schedule, if things weren't working out, she was hearing about it for the first time in the meeting. And by planning ahead, by being more communicative, by dialing up interactivity and inclusiveness, and even intentionality, giving them better direction about what her expectations were, those meetings didn't become scary confrontational events. Instead, they were constructive dialogues. So she was more able to be assertive. So even some of those flatter aspects of her leadership were dialing up because she was working on a different strategy for working with people. And what you see here are the after results. So you'll see in the dark green on your screen are the three areas that we focused on for her development. And those were her, let's see, look back for just a second. Sometimes it's a little hard. They don't quite line up. Restraint, practical wisdom, and composure. And all those in dark green improved by 3 to 5%, which is statistically significant within 6 months. But what's also interesting is those lighter green lines. This is the case of a rising tide lifting all boats, because what happened was people saw her as improving in some of the other areas as well. Now, some of that is because we were using those levers, right? We were saying, well, why don't you include more people in your conversations or be more intentional in the way that you direct people so they know what to expect. So they were experiencing Amanda as a different leader in a lot of different ways, which was really, really fun to see. So just to move ahead, that's the individual level. Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Just a quick question that came up that just fits with Amanda, because somebody wrote a question that said, this feedback on emotionality for Amanda, would that happen if she were a man versus a woman? So how does that factor in when you're providing people feedback, how that sexism, if you will, could factor into this feedback?
Yeah. Well, there's really two answers to that question. One is that I do believe, and there's plenty of research on it, that people tend to notice the emotions of women more, and that's a positive and a negative for sometimes for women. But the assessment is gender neutral, and although we do have open-ended comments at the end, we're really asking people to rate a person in a situation. So within that situation for her at that moment, that was a very important thing for her to notice. And we see the same kinds of feedback from men as well. So I wouldn't say, as a matter of fact, we did some gender research. We don't have it included today, but I would be happy to forward you some of our gender research later if you'd like to see it. One of the interesting things was that women were seen as equally confident as men in all of our data when you rate them, you know, by the standards and by the definition of confidence that we have.
Good, thank you.
All right, so we did work with a group of leaders in this company, Amanda being one of them, and in this program, this was, again, a conversation changer for the organization. What they wanted to do is they wanted to put a cohort of leaders through a 2-day, what we call Executive Presence Mastery Program, and then have the others have light touch coaching, which was a call a month. So pretty light touch coaching. They all went through the assessment. And what I'm going to show you now are the cohorts scores. So what you're looking at in the green bars and the red bars in each of the facets, what do those stand for? In authenticity, it means that 9 of the 23 had it in their top 3, and 2 of the 23 had it in their bottom 3, and the rest were neutral. So, Neil, again, I'll ask you to see or tell me what jumps out at you when you see these scores.
Well, I think what jumps out at you is the appearance and authenticity are all very positive, but there appears to be a real lack of vision in terms of, the strengths of this leadership team. That's the area that obviously needs some attention.
Yeah, so these were leaders who showed up ready for the game, confident of their decisions, and this was one of those flawless execution kinds of companies that we talked about earlier. So authenticity was high. They would tell it like it is. They would make decisions, but they weren't necessarily including others and bringing them along. So they weren't meeting frequently with their own teams. And these were leaders who reported to the C-suite. So these were the next leaders of the organization. Pretty low in inclusiveness, so they weren't getting around to kind of bringing along even their own teams, and certainly not painting an exciting vision of the future. And I'll tell you what, when they saw these scores, because we assembled them as a group, it was a wake-up call. We didn't even have to say anything else. Immediately, they started talking about how, as a leadership cohort, as the next maybe senior leaders of the organization, they needed to dial up some of these qualities so that they could be better leaders for the organization. And what was interesting was, as I say, half of them roughly went through a 2-day program, and the other half went through pretty light touch coaching, but we saw similar results. What we saw was, what you're looking at now are the before ratings, and you see someone asked the question earlier, what about the difference between a manager and a direct report? So if you look at that second circle there, the vision circle, there's a red circle, that's the manager rating. The green circle up above is also for vision. So there was a huge discrepancy here between how the managers saw those leaders as not visionary and how others saw them. So again, kind of interesting to be able to look at the differences between rater groups. It really launches a better conversation in the organization about how we're showing up not only to our managers, but also our direct reports and our peers. Let me show you the after scores. So I'm going to click on it and you'll see what happens is there was a much greater convergence and the scores went up. So in about 75% of the leaders, their scores improved in on average between 11 and 14 of the facets. There were 3 leaders who actually saw their scores go down. And we're not sure why that happened, but, in all fairness and honesty in reporting, that was what we saw. So pretty interesting to see how these results came in. And what I think it really speaks to, because I'm often asked, boy, how on earth could you get, in such a short time with such light touch, how would you see scores improving as they did? And I really believe it's related to a few factors. One of them is the assessment itself, as you noticed, has a lot of face validity for leaders. And what that means is they understand concern, confidence, practical wisdom, intentionality. They're easy to remember, easy to understand. And yet underneath all that, the items in each are very detailed and actionable. So when a leader gets the feedback, there's a lot of self-coaching that can happen. Once they understand the importance of that quality in helping them become better leaders and the impact it's having on others, they tend to be very motivated to make the changes they need to make. And sometimes it's just small changes in behavior, as we know, that make a big difference. So Neil, I thought before we wrap up, because I know we're going to have a lot of questions, I'd like to take a look at, I mentioned some of the data analytics that we've been doing on leaders. Before we do that, why don't we take a couple questions and then we'll take a look at our growth research.
Okay, so a couple questions that are asked by our participants here that I thought were particularly relevant. You've got 15 dimensions, in the 3 categories. That's a lot of dimensions. If you had to boil it down to just 3 or 4 that you would say are most pivotal, that most drive executive presence, what would those 3 or 4 be?
Yeah. I think that I don't want to punt on the answer, but it is dependent upon who's the leader and what's the situation. So we often take our strengths for granted, and that's never a good idea because, many of us have subscribed for a long time to the idea of leveraging our strengths. The challenge for a lot of leaders is sometimes those strengths are, masked by some of our gap areas. So what's important for us, for an individual, is what's our situation? For example, if we need to drive growth in the organization, and I'll show you some of the research on that in a moment, then dialing up those qualities that matter to growth is what's important. If we need to lead innovation in our organization, then dialing up those qualities that matter to innovation are the ones that are most important. But I think the reason I've resisted saying there are 3 or 4 that really matter is not because they all matter equally to each leader, but they are a full picture of the leader in his or her ability to engage and align and inspire and drive results. And the more robust the feedback, the more nuanced the feedback, the more the leader is able to take action and change the things that matter.
Cool, thank you. It was a good answer. Another question that came up, and I know you could talk forever on this, but I'll just give you just a minute, and that is the implications of this for selection, and screening of candidates as opposed to a cessation.
Yeah. Well, we designed this assessment not for selection, so it's important to say that up front. However, I think in the use of, and many of our client organizations are beginning to look at data analytics, the use of it in tracking trends is very important. It's important for us to know in our organizations what I showed you before in that one company, what are our general strengths and what are some of our gap areas. Because what happens, as we know in many organizations, is the halo effect takes over, right? We're trying to change our leadership, but we tend to promote people who are, more like us. So I know, like you say, that there could be a long way to answer that question, Neil. But what I think is most important in succession is to have a lot of data that we marry up to important data on the business. So just as finance and marketing and customer data is taken into account in organizations, I think it's incumbent upon human resources and talent to begin to look at the leader data and make a connection between those two things. That's really when it becomes valuable, I think, in overall succession as well as leadership development. And if I may, just as a way of illustrating that, I'd like to talk about the research that we did on growth, because it would be very much aligned with the conversation on what kind of leaders are best to lead our organization and succession conversation. So very briefly, the methodology for this was we looked at all the companies in our database who were high growth and low growth, and we defined that. We defined average GDP as 2% over the 3 years we did the study, with standard deviation either way, defining high growth and low growth, and then we took out everybody in the middle. So we were only looking at the high growth and low growth companies. And as you look at the model again, and there are 15 qualities of executive presence, I think the rhetorical question I would ask would be, which ones do you think would matter the most? And if you're guessing, it's really hard to know, right? I mean, we all would have a guess, but we might be right and we might be wrong, which is why data analytics, I think, is really coming to the forefront in leadership development and succession and talent today. I'm going to show you the answers to the questions. Over a 3-year period, these are the qualities that we found were the biggest drivers of growth. In other words, these were the qualities that were highest in the leaders in high growth companies. So authenticity, integrity, practical wisdom, composure, and vision. And what you may notice about that is that none of them are in the style side or the execution side, even though we tend to promote leaders who are hard driving and rally people and make sure they know what they're supposed to do and get things done. Those turned out to be table stakes, as did confidence, another quality that we often look for when we're considering promoting a leader who's going to take on a P&L. And what mattered the most were the two qualities in character, authenticity and integrity. So what that says to me is that character isn't just a nice to have. It's not just a cultural, asset in an organization. It actually is connected to the bottom line. And what we found were these were the qualities in character and substance. These were the items that mattered the most. In other words, these were the highest rated in the leaders in high growth companies, the Super 9 as we call them. So the question would be in succession, again, if we go back to that, Neil, which of these qualities are your leaders excelling in? And at the individual level as well, if we're developing someone who's in the succession plan, are these qualities that they're rated highly in? So there's a developmental aspect to succession that I think is so important to remember. Here, by the way, are the high-powered 4, we call them. So these are the ones that really, really matter the most. These are high in high-growth companies and low in low-growth companies. And look at that, guided by a strong internal moral code. I'm not sure, it's very heartening to see that result, but I'm not sure everybody would have guessed that that was the most important quality in high-growth leaders. Neil, do you have another question you'd like to throw at me? I can talk about a leader who, was surveyed, who was high in integrity and in a high-growth company. But you can take a look at these, I think, just while we're sitting here, you kind of get the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I think because of our time, we should try and go through the second innovation piece. And rather than me having questions, there isn't any more that I would ask right at this point.
All right. So this was a leader in a high-growth company who eventually became the CEO of the company, and you can see his integrity scores were off the charts, and many people even said employees want him to become the next CEO, and it turned out that he did. So Neil mentioned that we have some research on integrity. And by the way, on this research on growth, which we're going by now, I think I'd like to say we have a white paper on this. I'd be very happy to send it to you. And it does share the stories of the high growth and low growth leader. So similarly, just like with any data analytics, which begins with a question, we also wanted to ask a question of our data, which is, what are the qualities that matter to innovation? Because, of course, 85% of CEOs rank it as one of their top 3 priorities. So it is important. How do we know we have leaders in our organizations who are able to lead innovation? The research methodology for this was just a little bit different because, of course, there's no Morningstar data on innovation. So what we looked at were the open-ended comments in the surveys, and we separated them by those who were referred to as innovative and creative and thinking out of the box and original and fostering experimentation. And we separated those from the non-innovation leaders who had negative comments in those areas. And so we were looking for comments like, Craig challenges us to be creative. And again, you could look at the model and say, which ones matter? And be kind of flummoxed by it because, frankly, a lot of them look important, don't they? But let me show you the results. This is what we found. What you see highlighted in yellow are the ones that mattered the most. Now, it doesn't mean that the others don't matter, but they were table stakes in innovation. So again, we see how important the character qualities like authenticity and integrity are, as well as restraint, the leader's ability to be calm and invite people in for conversations even when things aren't going well, to be curious about other people's ideas, to be interested in what they're creating. The dialogical side of executive presence also becomes important. Inclusiveness, interactivity, assertiveness. So getting people together, getting a lot of people around the table and getting them to have a good fight also turned out to be really important in innovation. So Neil, I think this is a good point for us to take a couple more questions.
Okay, I don't know. We've had a lot of comments while you were talking that were kind of reinforcing the connections that you were making, and people thought it was logical as to which dimensions were driving growth and driving innovation. Somebody else mentioned that they want to see that white paper that you referenced. Let me just take one quick look to see if we have any other questions. We don't really have any other questions, and we're just about out of time. So I think maybe we'll wrap it up at this stage. Suzanne, I'll just ask you one thing quickly. If there were just a few takeaways from all that you've covered that you'd like our participants to really remember and take home, what would those one or two things be?
Yeah. Well, executive presence is a phenomenon that we observe. And because we observe it through behavior. And behaviors can change. So if you're using personality type assessments in your organization, I always think that a 360 is a nice way to balance that, because it helps the leader see that he or she has a path forward for action to take to develop as a leader. And I always think the best leaders I've ever worked with are those that have invested in learning over the years, and they're always learning, even as senior executives. So encouraging and fostering an environment where leaders feel they always have something to learn, I think, is one of the most important things. And Neil, I know a couple of people did ask about the white paper. You'll see on the screen our website is bates-communications.com. And if you'd like the white paper, you can write directly to info@bates-communications.com. There's a white paper on innovation, there's one on growth, there's one on our executive presence model and assessment, and we also have some team work that we've been doing recently that might be of interest to those of you working with teams. So I just would invite you to write me at info@bates-communications.com.
Okay, so Suzanne, thank you so much for participating. We started this webcast by saying the only thing we all really agreed on is we didn't have a definition, and we would know it when we saw it. And we've spent an hour really digging into that and making so much more meaning out of this concept than we had before. So thank you very much for all the work that you put into this and the work that you're doing. I want to thank all of you participants who have taken the trouble to spend an hour with us. Suzanne will look through the questions because we have a record of them, and you can always contact her directly for, to get whatever questions you want answered. Again, you can download this whole presentation and hear it later or share it with friends. Let's see. I wanted to go back to, finally, just to promote the Conference Board's next big conference, which is around leadership development, which is going to be in San Diego in June. I don't think you can beat San Diego in June. So again, that's our webcast. Thank you all for participating. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.